Cheers. Fantastic. Um, so we're rolling, and I'm mindful of the time because of what I shared before. So I'm just going to get into it. Um, and I'm going to begin with like a welcoming. So I share greetings and I do a namaste and assalamu alaikum and shalom and buenos dias, hisache, ni hao, kwe walakota, bena asmugo, one love and peace to each of you, Bud and David and everyone who is watching at this moment. Um, and we are here to talk about the experience and the walk of world social work and world citizenship and world interfaith harmony. Um, and I am Peter Johansson Osisi. I work with the Melange Ethos Institute as well as Asona Ashram. I'm joined with I'm joined here with Bud Heckman, who we've arrived at a compromise. I can refer to him as one of the most interesting men of the interfaith movement. He is a philanthropic consultant with many affiliations and a very strong CV of working with organizations like the United Religions, Religions for Peace, and I'm getting some feedback. El Hebrew Foundation, and consulting with additional organizations like United Religions Initiative, Parliament of the World's Religions, the Tri-Faith Initiative, and the list goes on. And so I know Bud for over a decade at this point at our affiliation with the North American Interfaith Network. I think we most recently see each other in person at the Parliament of the World's Religions a few years ago. And so, a dear brother, Bud Heckman, thank you for joining us today. And also we have David Gallup, who is another dear brother who I know for a number of years at this point, who is the executive director of the World Service Authority. I have something that resembles that background behind you, this right here. Like I said, I know David for a number of years, and I've actually been involved with the World Service Authority for over a decade at this point. And he does some tremendous work in terms of building people's consciousness and pragmatism towards the experience and the actuality of world citizenship and cooperation amongst the many peoples of the earth. And so we're here on this day to talk about this experience. And in doing that, I have two stories and a song to share, to be brief. So yesterday, I'm here at Case Western Reserve University, and I visit here on a regular basis. And yesterday I was here, and I approached the Interfaith Center to offer Duhar Salat and perform some Samadhi with my Talit in tow. And on my way there, I come across another dear brother, Ramez Islambuli, who is a professor. He's the faculty advisor of the Muslim Student Association, and he opens the door for me to get into the Interfaith Center. And so he's on his way to class. He says, "I'm on my way to class." I'm like, "Okay, what's the topic?" He says, I'm teaching a class on ritual." I'm like, "Oh, that's interesting, ritual, okay." And so he describes a little bit about that, and then so. I say, you know what? I paused for a minute because I was uncertain whether to share this, because sometimes when we're pluralistic, we have to be careful about how much we share about other traditions. But I took the liberty because I know him for over a decade doing work on this campus. So I say, you know what? Confucius talks a lot about rituals, and I'm studying Confucius at this moment. He says, "Oh, is that so?" He shows me his paper, and on the top of it, the topic heading, it says Confucius, and it starts talking about what Confucius says about ritual. So I'm like, aha. And that's one of those awesome moments when we come from our different backgrounds and we see that there's that connectivity of significance. And I find that particularly important because we're in the midst of a ritual at this moment, this World Interfaith Harmony Week that the United Nations convenes each year. And the United Nations draws from this legacy of rituals that Confucius and so many of our teachers provide in these yearly commemorations and observances to heighten our mindfulness, our intentionality, our education, and our activism along the different themes that are being emphasized. And so this week is World Interfaith Harmony Week, and so I thought that was a very appropriate anecdote to consider as we get into this. The other story that I have is also from yesterday. I visited another brother, David, who is a medical anthropologist here at Case. And I have a meeting with him, and I'm a little bit late, about 10 minutes late. Had trouble finding the building, getting access to it, and additionally, I'm about 10 minutes late, and I arrive at the door thinking, well, he's from Uganda. He's CPT. He'll be fine. Cool. So as he's opening the door, he's already on the phone talking to somebody else, and he raises his eyebrow and he goes, I say, aha, a little bit presumptuous, so I was. But it was all cool. We hug and then we have a fantastic meeting. So that was another anecdote from yesterday as we talk about the timeliness of ritual. And I keep that in mind as we continue on for this afternoon. Now, the one other thing I have to say before we get into this, we actually had another participant planned today, but she's unable to attend. She's actually a student here at Case at the Mandel School for Social Work. And so um, she initially was intended to speak on the experience of, or the interest of social work and the notion of world social work. And so I'm standing in on that behalf today. So before I do that though, I'll share this song. This week is also the birthday of one Bob Marley, who is one who is shares. I see smiles on the faces, so that registers a little bit, and I see that around the earth. So that's very duly appropriate. His birthday is mañana, tomorrow. And so I have a wee bit of a song, an excerpt that I just hear. I've heard it a long time before, but it just recently becomes my new favorite Bob Marley song. And so, and this is after listening to Bob Marley music for a decade. So I just share a little bit of that as we begin into this convo. And I appreciate your patience in my soliloquy. Here's the song. In this life, in this life, in this oh sweet life, we're coming in from the cold. Do 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 do. Coming in, coming in, coming in, coming in, coming in, coming in, coming in from the cold. Dun, 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 dun. It's you, it's you, it's you I'm talking to. Yeah, now you, you I'm talking to now. Why do you look so sad and forsaken? Don't you know when one door is closed, many doors are open? Would you let the system get on top of your head again? No, dread, no. Would you let the system make you kill your brother, man? No, dread, no. Would you let the system get on top of your head again? No, dread, no. The biggest man you ever see was once a baby. In this life, in this life, in this oh sweet life, we're coming in from the cold. So that's my two songs in the story, or two stories in a song, which Confucius also emphasizes, the songs in our stories. So with that in mind, I invite us to continue into the conversation. And this is the segue where Natalie's supposed to come in and say, oh, now world service, or world social work. And I'm supposed to stop talking and let it go. But I have to keep on talking a little bit because I'm stepping in. So I'll give a little bit of a spiel on the topic of world social work. As we're coming in from the cold in this winter day. It's kind of warm for today, but world social work. This past year, I see a video on YouTube on the experience of at the Hopi Nation and the Hopi Reservation around the vicinity of Nevada and New Mexico. And a lot of the problems that are experienced in terms of infrastructure, water, food, and additionally on the reservation are shared in many urban areas and additionally. And this is something that typically a community development corporation addresses. Community development corporations being effectively grassroots type government service providers, doing housing, doing community service, education, job training, job placement, and additionally, but basically stepping in where there are absences of what the government is providing at the moment at the local level, geographic, local, community, neighborhood based. And so when I'm watching this video on Hopi Nation and seeing like some severe devastation, I mean, people talk about the conditions on native reservations being the most abject in the Western Hemisphere. Exactly in the midst of the most affluent experiences. So there's severe challenges, and so job placement, employment is a severe problem. Health, and additionally typical problems. And one particular problem that was emphasized was fresh water and building infrastructure, plumbing, cultivating a well to provide fresh water for the reservation, the population on the reservation. And I'm thinking to myself whilst I'm listening to this that this is the exact type of project that an Inter-American Development Bank supports, or the United Nations Development Program, and additionally, because that's exactly what these agencies do in terms of identifying problems that are experienced by an entire collective, an entire community, and working with the elected or the established community leadership, governors, mayors, or what have you, to establish programs that help the community. But I think to myself, you know what? The Hopi Nation is probably completely oblivious to probably the whole UN system, let alone all the local or the regional development banks and NGOs and IGOs that are doing these types of initiatives. So I called them up and I said, hey, do you at least even know about this? And they're like, what is that? I'm like, well, I can give you some information if you want. I'm like, yeah, okay. So I gave them a little bit of, actually a considerable description of all the different services and programs and initiatives, and they're like, we'd like some additional information about this. So that's a conversation that's continuing, and I say that particularly because I'm involved with the Cleveland American Indian movement here in the Cuyahoga area, and that's actually how I got in contact with Natalie. She reached out to Cleveland AIM, and her communication got forwarded to me, and that's what she and I are in the conversation of addressing needs for Native brethren here in the Cuyahoga area. And so that's the consideration, is that we know that there are a lot of needs in local urban areas and rural areas, and on the res, and additionally, that are being unmet for whatever reason, and that many of these situations, many of these challenges are exactly within the mandate of many international NGOs and IGOs and initiatives. But there's a challenge in facilitating that direct connection, or even just the knowledge, for people to connect with funds and services and additional support. And so that's the idea of social work, is facilitating that connection, and providing those channels of support and cooperation accordingly. And so that's basically the idea of world social work. And I share that with the consideration of these additional elements that we talk about in terms of world citizenship and world interfaith harmony. But at this point, I'm gonna leave it at that, and I'm gonna invite you, David, to talk about your work with World Service Authority, and share your spiel on world citizenship with the individual, and what that translates into in terms of collective cooperation, and then how that collective cooperation addresses the pragmatic needs that we're experiencing as world citizens and world society. And I'm gonna mute my thing because I know that I have some background music here, so I'm gonna mute myself, and I welcome you, David, to share your experience.
Sure. Thank you, Peter. I really appreciate this opportunity to speak with everyone about the concept of world citizenship. I'm a human rights lawyer, so I come from it from a legal perspective more so than a conceptual or philosophical perspective, although I also have the philosophical perspective on it too. So let me just start by saying that, citizenship is our rights and duties within a particular communal framework. So whatever that framework is, or whatever that community is, we as citizens have the power and the right to determine what our rights are, as well as determine how, on the duty side of it, how we'll help our fellow humans, not just humans, but also our fellow beings on the planet and the earth itself as its own ecosystem, as its own, you might say, being. And I think humans have a lot of hubris to think that we're sort of separate or perhaps above or beyond nature, when we aren't. We're part of it. And part of understanding what world citizenship is about is to know that we don't own anything. We don't own the world in the sense the world owns us, or we should be good stewards of the planet, protecting the planet, because if the earth dies, we die. If humanity dies, we die with it. So it's a question of really fundamental two questions that are, in my mind, the most important questions of the 21st century, which are, who are you? And how do we ensure the survival of humanity in the earth? And I worked with a man named Gary Davis, whose lifelong work was, part of it's in his memoir, My Country is the World. There's a new film out, a documentary called The World is My Country, and you can find out more about that at theworldismycountry.com. And his story, how he gave up his national citizenship in favor of world citizenship, to point out the fact that these two important issues of who we are, and he would say, well, I'm a world citizen, or we all are world citizens by birth and in fact, and how do we ensure the survival of humanity in the earth? And he came from it from the perspective of, well, he was a comedian, an actor, but an individual who wanted to just make people laugh, but who was put in a bomber plane and had to drop bombs on cities in Belgium and in Germany during World War II. And he knew that those bombs weren't killing supposed military factories or targets, but were killing civilians, the women, the children, the men who he wanted to make laugh. And he had a lot of remorse after World War II. And he said, I need to get out of this war system. And he said, well, what can I do to do that? So he read a book called Anatomy of Peace by Emery Reeves, a really wonderful book that sort of debunks all the isms: capitalism, communism, socialism, internationalism, religionism, all in favor of this idea that we can, as human beings, create the void that exists beyond the nation right now and see ourselves as the biggest tribe as world citizens. So that was part of the reason why he gave up his citizenship, was what he read in Anatomy of Peace. Partly was due to the killing that he did and his remorse for that killing, and the fact that his brother was killed on his brother's battleship during World War II. So he gave all that up, and he lived his whole adult life as a world citizen. I was honored to work with him for almost 25 years here at our offices in Washington, D.C. at World Service Authority. So he was sort of my guru in understanding this concept of world citizenship and what that meant. So to the answer of who are you, of course, Gary Davis would say, well, we are all world citizens by birth and in fact. And if we don't know that, then all we're going to do is continue the fighting, the anger, the destruction of our home, which is planet Earth. And if we don't answer the question of how do we ensure the survival of humanity and the Earth, no other issues will matter. So for him, putting the word world in front of citizenship meant that all of our rights and duties that we might see within a local communal framework here in our city or our region have to be expanded to the highest level. And one of the main documents which he actually helped, and this is a little known story, helped to get unanimously recognized, was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He held a big event in Paris the night before the vote on the Declaration of Human Rights on December 9th, 1948. And there was almost 20,000 people at the Vélodrome d'Hiver in Paris. And basically the people spoke and said, we want our universal rights respected as human beings. And the next day, instead of vetoing it or rejecting it, there were certain groups of countries that over the last few years had been rejecting it. And I won't say the names of the countries to not offend anybody, but those countries decided to abstain instead of rejecting it outright. And that meant that it passed unanimously, and this really became, initially, a wish list. Then it became more than that, because, and I would say now it's customary international law, because a lot of the principles have been embedded in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, as well as, of course, in the UN Charter, Articles 55 and 56. So Gary had a part in demanding that our universal rights be respected, and that our status as human beings, that we could claim a status beyond the nation state. And even here in the United States, there are aspects to our national constitution, like the Ninth Amendment, which says that the enumeration of certain rights in the Constitution shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people, meaning we, the people, can determine what our rights are. And one of those can be to choose an allegiance beyond our family, our city, our state, our country, our region, and even the world. I mean, at some point, as soon as we meet those extraterrestrials who are bound to be out there, then we would have a universal citizenship. It wouldn't just be a world citizenship or Earth citizenship. It would be a universal one. Or, and if there's a multiverse, then a multiversal one. So it's a question of knowing that our rights and duties are the same, whether we're here, where I am in Washington, D.C., or wherever anyone is around the world. Those same rights and duties exist at the highest level. We're not trained that way. Unfortunately, we're taught oftentimes by our national leaders or other leaders, or even in schools, that rights are grants by states, and that the individual doesn't have much power in changing our world. but actually rights are innate, we're born with them, and they are unalienable, meaning we cannot sell them away, we cannot give them up. So these rights and duties, whether we're here locally or globally, should be respected. But to get them respected on a global level, we need to start seeing ourselves as human beings first and foremost, as world citizens. So let me give you just a quick example, because I think it's helpful to elucidate this, and especially because you've asked that what are the rights and responsibilities of the individual, and how do we help others sort of in our collective community. So a quick example, and once again, I'll leave out, place names just to not offend anybody, but there was a case not long ago where there was a child born in a certain place of the world. His parents were of different ethnicities than the country where the child was born. And because of this, you might say, ethnic or xenophobic sort of feeling, the government, even the local government of that one place, would not give the child a birth certificate. Simply because the child didn't have a birth certificate, he could not go to the doctor and get the important, inoculations or shots that he needed, and could not go to school. So the parents contacted our organization, World Service Authority, and said, could you please issue a document for us? So we issued him a world birth certificate. And then that still was part of it. That helped him go to the doctor, at least, because then the doctor can say, okay, now you're real, just because he was documented. He had a piece of paper. It's ridiculous how humans put more credence on a piece of paper, on a document that's also a human construct, than on the actual live individual there before them. But so then what we did was we got an apostille, or an authentication, on top of that birth certificate by getting a notarization about the document, and then going to the Office of Authentication, then putting a fancy seal and a ribbon on it. So once again, people look at these fancy things, like, oh, then it's legitimate, even though the person there in front of them is legitimate without that. But they took that, and because this one country was a party to the Hague Convention on Apostilles, the government was then really basically required to respect the able to go to school. So it's amazing how, we live in a world, according.
Excuse me, David. I'm uncertain if you're still talking. I've gotten a little bit of a technical difficulty. There's been a freezing.
And this really affects
There's
people.
been a freezing on my feed, so I'm uncertain if you're experiencing that as well, or if that's
I'm able to hear David.
Okay, all right.
I think it's your reception.
Okay. Maybe it's on your side, Peter, because I can hear Bud too. So
okay.
Anyway, so I'll speed this up because I know I don't want to take up too much more time here. But so just to say that even 50% of the people who are women and girls who are 50% of the population who are undocumented, there's a major problem with documentation. And once again, you might not be able to vote. You may not be able to own property. You might not be able to even enter an office building if you don't have documentation. And what we're saying here is really, and Gary Davis would always say, documentation isn't important. The world password is sort of an anti-password. The point is to get rid of those requirements altogether so we can act with one another, share with one another our beautiful planet. And know that when you come across another fellow being that they have rights and duties, and we should all see ourselves as world or universal citizens. And I would say one of the things that we do is, because we do deal with a lot of vulnerable populations, whether it's indigenous populations or the Rohingya refugees, as an example. A million of them almost fled from Myanmar to Bangladesh because they were stateless. The government there would not, and here I'm naming names, sorry, but the government would not give them local citizenship, even though many of them had been living there for generations. So what does that mean when a national government can simply say, oh, you don't really exist, and then won't provide them, like you were talking about, social services? They don't have access to those social services that are so important. One of our many projects is to establish world citizenship as a valid legal status for every human being, so that you wouldn't just have a basis of human rights respected, but all your human rights. So no matter where you find yourself on planet Earth, you should be able to live, work, vote, get healthcare benefits or whatever, just because you're a being or a human being. And one of the things, because I know I want to end my comments here really shortly, is just to promote this thing. We're trying to, and I don't know how well you can see that, but we're trying to create a World Citizen Club, and it's kind of blurry, but we're trying to create a World Citizen Club. We've already launched a few, but but we're trying to create them around the world, and in particular starting in North America, I guess. High school and college students coming together and saying, I've got a passion, whether it's to deal with world poverty, to deal with the world refugee issue, to deal with the world climate issue, some of these crucial issues that are impacting all of humanity as world citizens. And I want to work on that even here in my local community, because maybe they could do, a beach cleanup or a street, cleanup of their local community, and that will, impact the world in the long run. Or they can take up a poverty issue and highlight in their backyard where people are suffering from economic discrimination or people who don't have access. So we're hoping to build up this idea of students starting World Citizen Clubs on their campus. We have a website for that, which is worldcitizenclub.org. So I encourage people to take a look at that. But I don't want to take any much more time, because I know where time is short.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much. That's so much. I appreciate the energy, the information, and I'm very hesitant, like pausing, but we are on a time crunch, so I want to be mindful of that and give Bud an opportunity to talk. What I'll do is I'm thinking like I'll put links to your website and websites that you referenced there, so that people can refer to that accordingly. And I also mentioned our friend Nathaniel Mills. I was mentioning who introduces me to World Service Authority. Dear friend, from a brother from law school, and involved in the Olympic movement as well. And also just to give you this, to give some additional tangibility, when you talk about transcending lines, the fine line of transcending lines, lines are purposeful in this life, but oftentimes we evolve to a point where they become rigid, and so we have to kind of like be mindful of that and do it. And I'll say this: recently, I saw a video of a recording of a hip hop radio station where they were interviewing Mos Def, Yasin Bey. He gives a shout out to you directly and gives a thanks to you for your helping him in the situation in South Africa when he was using the World Service Authority passport to go from South Africa to Ethiopia. And so I'm just going to put that out there. And when his message is getting to the hip hop community, that means there's some traction, and like it's getting there. So I appreciate that, and I meant to say that before. So. Thank you very much, and continue on to Bud. I know I gave you a whole list of things like to cover, and it was like, yo, Peter, what do you expect? 7 minutes? What? But maybe I'm sure you have some thoughts already that you have in mind. But I think what might be helpful also is just like what motivates the religious community and the interfaith community to kind of bring this idea of world citizenship and the kumbaya that we experience and that we talk about in the interfaith movement into the needs of the communities.
Thank you for inviting me to be on, Peter. I find you want to be one of the most interesting people in interfaith yourself. You're an autodidact and you're so knowledgeable about so many different areas. I did want to correct one thing that you said in the introduction of me, which is I have not actually consulted for the United Religions Initiative. I've been involved in collaborative projects with them, but the other stuff is actually accurate. I did have the privilege of being at the Church Center for the United Nations, which is a building that was built by the United Methodist Women directly across the street from the UN, and working for Religions for Peace and various manifestations between 2001 to about 2018. I actually still do volunteer stuff related to the Religions for Peace family and appreciate the work with them. Also other entities at the same time. My colleague at Religions for Peace assisted me in writing an article for New Routes magazine, volume 16. I put the link to it in the chat box there, but it's called The UN and Religious Bodies in Common Search for Peace. And it gives some of the long history leading up to basically the background of the UN and their work with religions, and then leading up to the World Interfaith Harmony Week, which is what you asked me to speak about, directly. Religious institutions have been involved with the UN since its very beginning, helping to breathe life into some of its founding documents, declarations, and principles. Some of the initial meetings for the preparatory committees and so forth met at churches at Westminster Abbey Church, originally overseas, and then in San Francisco as well. I think it's important that we note that religions are arguably so not like any other force in the United Nations orbit. And why is that so? Because they have a force that parallels and in some ways surpasses governments, and in most cases have a much larger, deeper history and footprint than what individual governments and even some intergovernmental bodies actually have. And I think that puts them in a different sort of aura in terms of working. So there's been a tensiveness between religions and the UN. You think about also the age of it. You're talking about an institution that's like 75 years old, and you're talking about religions that are hundreds of years old or thousands of years old. So a religion counts report in 2002 titled Religion and Public Policy at the UN found 3 overarching facts about religion at the UN. One, religion is actually actually present at the United Nations. Religion's role at the UN is unclear to many, and religions, individuals, and groups at the UN don't have any unified perspective on either the issues before the UN or the appropriate role of the religion at the UN. And I have to say that that latter thing has been getting better, but basically all three of those things remain true. It is getting a little clearer about religion's role at the UN, and there is some unified perspective. There's been common work on the Sustainable Development Goals, the Millennium Development Goals, and a series of things over the past decade in particular that has helped shape and sharpen what's actually happened. All of that said, it's important to note that it's easier for governments to work with interfaith coalitions rather than individual religions or individuals per se, because working with individual religions lends to the appearance of offering a preference for some sort of favoritism. And the modern interfaith movement has basically provided a solution to the UN and being able to work with coalitions of religious peoples and bodies. It's also important to note, perhaps, that the interfaith movement, in effect, in its modern manifestation, was born after the United Nations. It really came to birth in the 1960s, and you're looking at the UN being born right after World War II. And there are three big sort of like periods of boom movement in that. In the 1960s, you have a lot of creativity and reimagination of alliances and so forth. And in the United States context, you have the Voting Rights Act, the Immigration Naturalization Act, and the Civil Rights Act, all of which eventually gave shape to like a lot greater diversity in the United States, particularly so the Immigration and Naturalization Act, which has drastically changed the demography of the U.S. In the middle of the 1990s, you have the remanifestation of the Parliament of World Religions 100 years after its first meeting. And then you have from that a rebirth of sorts of Religions for Peace and a new manifestation. And you have the new birth of the United Religions Initiative through Bishop Bill Swing and his advocacy. So the Parliament, Religions for Peace, and URI eventually become the three big interfaith international organizations. And in the post 9/11 era, there was a heavy emotional and I'd say some financial investment in the development of interfaith organizations, which created a greater opening for collaboration and made foundations and governments and intergovernmental organizations feel like they could work with the interfaith movement, and that there was a necessity, an urgency of now to do so because of the fear that came from terrorism and from what was experienced in 9/11. In the 1960s, the Temple of Understanding and Religions for Peace both tried to create international bodies of different faiths. And one of the interesting things about that, the story behind Religions for Peace, is a rabbi who was well known in what is now the Union for Reform Judaism in the United States, Rabbi Maurice Eisendrath, simply just wrote an op-ed to the New York Times and said, hey, why isn't there a United Nations for religions? And, it's a simple question, and it received an outpouring of response from people around the globe, which led to meetings, which led to more meetings, which basically led to the creation of what is the largest representative international interfaith organization, Religions for Peace. It was just his question that basically drew people together, because he had a monk from India and a priest from Germany and so on. The stories go all around responding to him saying, are you serious? Because if you are, I'll join you. Which is a beautiful, sort of thing about people having a sense of world citizenship, if that's what you're wanting to speak to. Bill Vinley, who came to head Religions for Peace in the late 1990s, actually revamped it from being like chapters to being interreligious councils. And he also garnered the attraction of bringing some people from the UN and also leadership from the Ford Foundation, or Rockefeller Foundation rather, to Riva Dogarty, which is the 1994 Sixth World Assembly of Religions for Peace. That actually changed how people saw things, because the leadership from the Rockefeller Foundation came back and talked with other foundations. Both Ford and Rockefeller put in $1 million a year for many, many years into Religions for Peace. And UNICEF, UNESCO, UNFPA, UNIFEM, UNDP, which is the development program, all of them started developing partnerships and doing work with Religions for Peace because they saw the capacity of using sort of the deep down alliances and structures of religious systems to help deliver social goods, to do development work, to help combat conflictual situations. So there were a number of successful cases that followed where Religions for Peace could go in and make interventions in a place like, say, Sierra Leone, where there was conflict, and be able to work with the religious authorities when the political structures would break down, that there could still be dialogue amongst the religious leaders and they could work for peace. After 9/11, I'd say that the activity became much more popular. There was a great interest in it on the part of governments, and you have a whole bunch of different governments that started getting involved more heavily. Norway, Finland, Sweden, Netherlands are very notable for their large-scale and long-term funding, specifically around development issues in the global south. You also have USAID from the US government perspective, and then eventually the White House faith-based offices that start coming online and giving support in various ways to this kind of work. And then the UN formalized its sort of sense of working with interfaith movement through the interfaith and intercultural work that became developed by Spain and Turkey in the development of the UN Alliance of Civilizations. So that became sort of like the official arm of the United Nations, where some of that work began to resonate and be. Although interfaith work is across all the different agencies of the very complex entity of the UN. And one of the reasons that the UN actually needs the partnership of interfaith and many different other actors, all of the NGOs of various sorts, is because many people don't realize it, but the operating budget of the United Nations is actually the same as the Tokyo Fire Department. So it's not actually very large. They're highly dependent upon the good graces of the countries to give funds. Some of them, like the United States, have at times held back their money, which is crippling to the United Nations in terms of being able to actualize its work. So there's all of that. There was a significant event in the sense that Saudi Arabia's King Abdulaziz had a vision that he wanted to actually, in reflecting upon what actually happened in 9/11, so forth, to create an international interfaith organization that was intergovernmental. So he reached out to other governments and went through a multi-year process to develop what is now known as KAISID, that's in Vienna, Austria. It's significant because it has 50 staff and has a budget that's in the tens of millions in terms of what it is that it can execute. And other countries, Kosovo, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Russia, Japan, Indonesia, and so forth, all came online as well. And then you have Qatar with the Doha International Center for Interreligious Dialogue as well. So there's this rich development of governments becoming involved. Meanwhile, there's an interest on the part of people on the local level of wanting to affect what's actually happening at the UN, and there was a desire to create a UN decade for interreligious and intercultural dialogue, understanding, and cooperation for peace. If you could make a longer title, you wouldn't, I don't think it's a crazy long title. They simply just called it the UN Decade. But there was a long effort. It started with folks in the Tripartite Forum for Interreligious Cooperation for Peace, which was the Philippines and Pakistan working. There was a lot of independent coalitions. There were people from the Committee of Religious NGOs that tried to work on it, but individual people pushing to try to have this. They got upset because actually what wound up getting created was the World Interfaith Harmony Week, but I encouraged a lot of my colleagues to realize that having a decade that is strung out over a period of time and is just a once and off thing, or having a day that may not get recognized, having an entire week every single year is probably a better result than anything. And it was actually Jordan who came to the rescue and initiated a General Assembly resolution in 2010 to host the World Interfaith Harmony Week, and the Alliance of Civilizations, which was formalized by the UN to sort of recognize interfaith and intercultural stuff, helped to do some of the coordination around it. So it's been the country of Jordan, the UN Alliance of Civilization, and some other partners. Now some of the major interfaith organizations promote heavily the World Interfaith Harmony Week, such as Parliament of World Religions and URI. So there's all of that. In between all this, the work has gotten much more serious in the United Nations. The woman who's most apt candidate to be the new Secretary General of Religions for Peace for a long period of time after leaving Religions for Peace and running the Women's Network there, went to the UN and worked in UNFPA and helped to lead their global interfaith network for population and development, and then the interagency task force for engaging faith-based organizations around the MDGs and then later the Sustainable Development Goals. So there's a rich, deep history at the UN, and it's evolving, and I would say getting better and getting clearer as to what it is that religion can do with the UN. I hope that speaks to some of the things you were asking me to talk to.
That's fantastic, but I appreciate that. And whilst you were talking, I received a prompt on my screen. I don't know if you saw that too, but hey, we're at the 40-minute mark, and we got a little bit of a gift from Zoom that says we can keep on talking. And so we have a few additional minutes. It just says there removing the restrictions. So I presume that we're free to talk now. So haha. Fantastic. And I will note that you conclude exactly on the 40-minute mark. So kudos to you. So with that said, I have some follow-up questions now based on what you've just shared. So thank you very much for the insight. And I basically had two follow-up questions, but a little bit of a long-winded version of it, or semi-long-winded. So you mentioned some of the motivations or some of the impetus for religious communities to get involved in interfaith work. You mentioned the motivation of I'll refer to like the inspirational institutional motivation of like, hey, we should be doing this. Or like you mentioned, the rabbi with Religions for Peace. I remember the same story included within the birth of a global community that Reverend Charles Gibbs and Sally Mahe talk about when Bishop Swing starts the United Religions Initiative. Francis Younghusband and the Congress of World Congress of Faiths. In addition, there's just like, we should be doing this. So that's one motivating factor. Another one I find is like you described, when something happens and then in a response to that, like 9/11. And I remember seeing you write somewhere, I don't know if it's your LinkedIn bio or somewhere, that being a significant motivating factor for you getting involved in the interfaith movement. And that resonates with me because that's exactly when and a lot of why I get involved in it as well. So there's those kind of things. But at this point, there's a certain amount of steadiness in terms of the institutional development within the interfaith movement. I mean, there are a lot of the ones that you mentioned, even ones like International Association of Religions for Religious Freedom has been around for over a century. So we have that, but then we have like local groups that emerge. The first question is what in your experience, what brings the religious leaders, the religious communities to the table, other than just to do service for others and to do something that benefits people outside of their own community, for other purposes than proselytizing, or for other purposes than just responding to an event or something. But what are some of those other motivating factors that bring the religions to the table? And then the other thing is when you talk about the foundations coming in, like in Scandinavia or the Rockefeller, what are the motivating factors for those big institutions to fund it and to like invest and how are they investing in your experience? What kind of work, or what's the criteria that they look for when they're making that type of investment?
Yeah, my colleagues and I from 2001 to 2007 worked on collecting data basically about the interfaith movement in the United States and actually globally. And all of my learnings and their learnings were put together into a book called Interactive Faith. It's by Skylight Path Press, and it came out in 2008. It actually outlines different typologies of interfaith organizations. And I think that some of the motivations are actually mapped into that. So one of the things I spoke to is like a crisis, basically people responding to 9/11. So you have these large upsurges in the mid-1960s, in the mid-1990s being inspired by the Parliament of World Religions, or in post 9/11 of interfaith organizations growing. You can graph it actually, and we did basically to show when they came into being and how long they lasted and so forth. The inspirational activity of the parliament happening in 1993 gave a great birth to many. And then the crisis of 9/11 gave an even larger birth to many more. You also have motivation around a singular issue, which is interesting. So you have people that care basically about like clean water in their community, or wanting to address something with their public schools or whatever it is, and they decide to create an interfaith coalition to address it. So you have some like Interfaith Worker Justice or the Interfaith Alliance, which addresses like religious freedom issues that get around a specific purpose to create a sense of alliance. So the motivations are many, and the reasons for the birth of these different organizations, are multitude. With regard to the foundations and governments, I mean, quite frankly, one of the things they saw was like a light bulb went off, and they had almost a utilitarian point of view to look at religions as this is a lever by which we could reach many people. Because if you think about it, like, I've been a United Methodist since, I was a little kid. The United Methodist Church in the United States actually has more Methodist churches than there are U.S. post offices. There's a Methodist church in every single county in the United States. So when you talk about down to the local level, being able to disseminate something or, reach people in local communities, there's the structure of religious communities that's so very attractive to foundations and governments in order to, if they can reach an alliance to deliver, something like, wanting to put bed nets to help prevent people from getting malaria and being bit by mosquitoes in Africa, the way or the vehicle for doing that is to basically work with religious communities to do it. In fact, actually, over the course of my about 20-year career, I've seen major foundations just not be interested, and then all of a sudden light bulb goes off and they realize, oh, if we worked with religious communities, we could actually achieve this. You have Bill Gates and his foundation that had an aha moment, realizing that one of the best ways he could actually deliver what he wanted to do in Africa was to invest more heavily in interfaith coalitions, because they actually can get to the local level in a way that it would cost him an inordinate amount of money to build structures that are unnatural rather than natural to help deliver services. The caution to that is that many of the foundations and governments are looking at a usury sort of thing with religion, and the people that are from positions of faith that are working together want to protect their integrity of their faith tradition and what it is that they want to give emphasis to and have values or mission towards.
Thank you. And I want to provide David an opportunity to share whatever you might be thinking about. I do have a question, but I wanted to just like give you an opportunity to say anything or respond to anything that you felt appropriate at this point.
Yeah, I agree with Bud. I think interacting with people in religious communities is really important, because that's oftentimes where people find their value, the value to their life, value to existence, or determining why are we here, and I think that's something that when we talk about citizenship and world citizenship, the law, it's something completely separate from religion, other than to talk about like the golden rule, or some religions like the Baha'i faith, which actually embrace the idea, like Baha'u'llah said, that the world is my country and all humankind are my fellow citizens. But I do think every religion has at its base core, do unto others, that we should love thy neighbor, or we should treat each other the same. So I really feel like hearing this, I think this is a good lesson for me to say, oh, maybe we as educators of world citizenship need to be reaching out to interfaith communities more than we already have. We already are doing that. In fact, I don't know, but if you know a guy named Dave Otten, who's in St. Louis, he teaches religions at St. Louis University, and he's, I think, the head of the interfaith community there. Anyway, and so we're already trying to bring the idea of world citizenship, world federation to religious communities. I guess we just haven't maybe figured out the way to do that yet. So maybe, Bud, we need to have a chat at some point, so I could learn from you how we should make our way into that.
Yeah. The Scarboro Missions Center in Canada, which is now closed but has transferred its assets to a university, was actually a big originator of wanting to deal with all of the different manifestations of the Golden Rule, basically, and the ways in which it manifests itself. They created posters and educational materials and so forth, and it became a centering point for a lot of interfaith work. Is because interfaith work is often about working from a common place of common shared values of the religious traditions, regardless of the particularities of each tradition. So the Golden Rule was a tremendous sort of
Say the name of it.
Scarboro Missions Center in Canada, and they have the Golden Rule. A significant amount of work done there. It's actually been transferred to another center, but that's where I would say the most intense amount of work around the Golden Rule and the materials and resources are available. I can put you in touch with people that have been in charge of it.
What's the brother's name, the dear brother's name, who was heading that? It escapes me at the moment. Not to put you on the spot, but you know, because that same light bulb went off to me, because he's the one who's always doing the Golden Rule posters in the different languages.
Right. Yeah.
His name escapes. I thought it's right here, but
I'll come up with it in a second.
I know.
Yeah.
I know exactly what he looks like. He has the glasses, dark hair, and everything else, but the name escapes me at the moment. I saw him at the Parliament too. But that same light bulb went off when David mentioned the Golden Rule of like, Scarboro Missions and the Golden Rule poster.
Right.
So the follow-up question I have for you, David, is
Paul McKenna.
Paul McKenna, thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
So David, when you mentioned this notion of the nexus between the idea of the universality of humanity and world citizenship, and the theologies of the different religions of the world, and this notion of brotherly love, and additionally, I posed you this question, of like a visionary question of Let's say world citizenship becomes the convention. Let's say we're in that zone. We're in that moment. What does that look like, and what are we doing? What's like the how do we do that? What does it look like? And particularly when we relate it to the experience of religiosity, religions are big on service, of providing service to humanity. And so the consideration is, as world citizens and as a convention of world citizenship, how does that translate to people's religious practice, or not even just religious practice, but just the practice of service? How are we doing that through the guise of world citizenship?
Sure. Well, my little pun is that World Service Authority, its middle name is service, which it is. Our view of how do we bring the idea of citizenship and our rights and duties that are universal to everyone is through service to our fellow humans, service to the earth. And I think what would a world look like where world citizenship is practiced by everyone? Well, that would mean we have world peace, I would say, because peace is the presence of law, not the absence of war. And when I say world citizenship, some people get afraid when I say world citizenship because they think that we might be trying to get rid of the nation state, or like Gary did, he gave up. You don't have to give up anything. It's raising your awareness, your understanding, your comprehension to that higher level of existence, of our link to each other as fellow humans, and as linked to all the other beings on the planet and the earth itself. And us putting maybe you might say a legal perspective on that, saying that not only do we have these rights and duties, but we should be able to, if they're being violated by our fellow humans or a corporation or whatever else, we should be able to go to court and in a peaceful way, in a adjudicative or arbitration way, resolve our differences. So it would be a world where we're not going to ever get rid of our differences. We don't want to. We want to be able to transcend our differences so we can celebrate them. But we will still have differences and we will still argue, but we need to argue in a peaceful way, in a non-violent action way. That means that, so in a world where world citizenship is fully functioning, is a world where we will still have arguments, but they will be resolved peacefully. But all of our rights and duties should be met. I mean, I think one of the reasons why there's enmity either between religions or between groups of people is because we're almost, and it is almost like a fight. And I don't like to use that word lightly. It's like a fight for resources or a fight for power, rather than looking at our world as something that we should be thankful for as a gift and that we should share. So I think, having understanding, that's why we were trying to start these World Citizen Clubs, to get to youth as they're young and put these ideas in their head, because most of what I remember from at least history class is the story of one war to the next war to the next war, and not so much all the powerful things like Harriet Tubman did with the Underground Railroad, or some other, like Rosa Parks and her refusal to give up her seat on the bus to say, look, I have rights too. I'm being discriminated against. So I guess it's world citizenship for us would be having a world that's at peace, even despite our differences. So having a peaceful way and a legal way to deal with those differences, and making sure, of course, that everyone's rights and duties are fully met. Because if they're not met, that's what I think in the end leads to frustration, and then anger, and then unfortunately violence and war.
Well, so one of the takeaways that I'm drawing from what you're describing is having world citizenship being a conversation, and being a conscious engagement of civics, of being able to solve problems, and cooperate with a global, or I just used the wrong word, I know, with a world consciousness, with an earthwide consciousness.
Sure.
And so. You mentioned Rosa Parks, and I was actually thinking at that a minute beforehand about what I mentioned before with the Most Def incident in Yasin Bay, traveling from South Africa. I was thinking to myself, that sounds like a Rosa Parks moment for the idea of world citizenship. And the other thing also is, along the lines of having that conversation, is that it's a teaching moment. It's a teachable moment. And obviously, it's not the most pleasant of things for Yasin Bey, because he was detained for a while, and additionally, but meanwhile, cats back here in the U.S. are like, yo, what's this all about? They're just hearing rumors, and he was trying to flee this, that, and the other, and what's going on with was he getting up? Is this another Dave Chappelle moment or whatever else? But so there's a lot of like, because cats in the hip hop community, they don't, to be honest, they don't have a lot of time or patience for philosophizing. They're like, we don't have time for these ideas. We got to pay the bills. And so,
Looking for your next meal, you know, you don't have
yeah,
time.
exactly. And so here comes Mos Def. I want to respect him referring to himself as Yasin Bey, but I have familiarity with Mos Def. Here's Yasin Bey, who has this notoriety or this notable name and experience, who gets into this situation. It's a teachable moment because now there's the opportunity of saying what world citizenship is. So the first thing he did when he was in this interview, and this is one of the major New York radio stations or whatever in the land of the Haudenosaunee. He's explaining what happened, and so he's like, first of all, what I did perfectly legal. Like I wasn't trying.
Wrong.
Exactly, and it's necessary to like say that to communicate that and be upfront. He's like, it's a thing. It's legal. It's legit. It's been around for years. But now he gets into the explanation, and so he says like he professes himself as a world citizen and what that means, why he does that, and just like the actuality of life and politics, and additionally, and how he identifies. And so, like I said before, when he is involved and when he goes through this kind of experience and showing like it's not just some kind of thing of like going to a protest or whatever. But like, no, he was in another country, in another land with his family, and he got locked up. He was on the front lines of world citizenship, and so that has credibility. And now people are thinking, okay, well, what's this going on? And so when it reaches to that kind of like ground level kind of conversational level, now we're starting to build at that point. And I think that's exactly like where the breadth of conversation that we need with world citizenship, but also with the other addition when we talk about interfaith, and additionally in the Kumbaya. I was having a conversation on my village corner this past week. A brother asked me. I sit on my village block, which has a lot of restaurants and stuff like that people walk by, and I just sit there and I make conversation with people. So on this one occasion, I'm known for doing that. This one occasion, like, yo, dude, I see you here all the time. What are you doing? And so I started talking about it, and I mentioned the word kumbaya. And I say that when I say what I do, I'm a spiritual diplomat. I do kumbaya. And some people ask me about it, some people don't. But then this brother asks me, and he's like, "Yeah, what do you think kumbaya means? Like, what does that mean to you?" Because a lot of people do it as a dismissive thing. And I say, if we look at the literal translation from the spiritual song culture, it means come by, hear God. It's a calling of God to help into this situation. And so I say that because when we had that conversation on the street, it's to be honest, like a lot of cats on the street, when they see these type of things, they just like, oh, those are people that don't have anything better to do with their time. They have the opportunity, the privilege to vacation in these ideas. But here I am on the street, and I'm saying I'm doing kumbaya. And I told him, yo, I'm on the street. You see me. I'm doing this on a regular basis. And when he sees that, I don't have to say anything further. He's just like, all right, okay, I feel that. And so there's traction, there's resonance. And that's where things start to like to take hold and take shape. And so I think that when I was listening to you describe like what your intentions and vision is with world citizenship and being able to have that conversation, I think, I mean, what world citizenship looks like perhaps is maybe very similar to what today looks like, but just with a different mindset and with a greater efficacy in terms of the peaceful cooperation accordingly, and providing the service accordingly. So I want to be mindful of our time, because even though we can talk ad infinitum on Zoom at this point, I know we all have other things to do as well. So I'm going to kind of like prepare as we kind of maybe share some closing thoughts or some wrap up thoughts or anything else that either of you would like to share before we wrap up.
I think it would be nice if David would share some in the chat box before he closes out, some of the links that he had suggested. I know you were going to post some as well, Peter.
Sure.
I posted the link to the article and also the reference to the Golden Rule site. I appreciate our conversation today.
Cool. Thank you, bud.
Yeah, and so from my standpoint, I would say, one love, one heart. Let's get together and we'll be all right.
You know what? Beautiful, David. You know what? I think that's a very appropriate way to wrap it up. And that's exactly how the documentary on Marley wraps up as well. A montage of people from all around the earth singing that song. It's a beautiful thing. And so I think that's very appropriate. And seva is just the word that comes to mind from Sanskrit and in the tradition, service and just the well-being, the healing that we provide through that tikkun olam. Just throw in another word. So thank you both, Bud and David, for joining in this conversation today. Very much appreciate it, and look forward to the follow through in our continuing work. So, cheers.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you. Appreciate
Love
it.
and peace to you both.
You too.
All right.
Bye.